The oldest king list in human history doesn't start with a human king. It starts with something stranger than that. It starts with rulers who supposedly governed for tens of thousands of years over cities that, even by ancient standards, were already ancient. Cities that feel like they're standing at the edge of history, right before history fully turns on. And tonight, we're going to ask a question that most scholars avoid saying out loud, even when the evidence is sitting right in front of them. What if the first kings weren't human at all? Before we go any deeper, if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow dives into ancient records, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what pulled you towards Sumerian history in the first place. Because it's always wild to me how people separated by oceans and time zones end up captivated by the same old questions. Authority, legitimacy, power, and where rule even comes from. All right, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's step carefully into what the earliest written civilization recorded about power itself. And just to be clear, this isn't a video about ancient astronauts. This isn't a hidden technology thing. We're not forcing modern theories onto clay tablets. We're doing something more unsettling. We're reading what the Sumerians wrote, straight, cold, official, and we're taking their claims seriously as claims, not as jokes, not as cute myths, not as symbolic stories we can safely ignore. We're looking at their political record-keeping and asking, what kind of worldview produces a document like this? Because here's the thing about the Sumerian King List. It isn't preserved in one place like a single sacred manuscript. It exists in multiple copies, different cities, different centuries, different scribes, Nippur, Larsa, Babylon, hundreds of years apart, and they're copying the same framework, the same structure, the same opening claim. Kingship descended from heaven. Not a tribe chose a leader. Not a strong man took control. Not society became complex and invented government. No, kingship came down, already formed, like something delivered, and it landed first in Eridu. Then the king list does something that should make you sit up a little straighter. It names the rulers of that first city, and it gives their reign lengths. Not decades, not even centuries, but reigns measured in impossible spans of time. Alulim, the first ruler, is said to have reigned for 28,800 years. His successor, Alauger, ruled for 36,000. Then Enmenluana ruled in Bad Tibber for 43,200 years. Those numbers show up again and again across surviving copies. They're not one scribal mistake. They're not a single city exaggerating for prestige. This is a pattern, preserved carefully, consistently, like it matters. And what makes this even stranger is how the king list was used. This wasn't a bedtime story. This wasn't a poem. This was political documentation. Formal legitimacy. Later Mesopotamian kings, real historical kings, anchored their right to rule in this sequence. They treated it like a foundation, like a chain of authority that stretched backward into a world before the flood. So we have to pause and really feel what that means. Every modern political system, democracy, monarchy, dictatorship, theocracy, argues about who should rule and why. But we share one basic assumption. Governance is a human invention, something society builds. The Sumerian King List preserves something radically different. It says kingship existed before human civilization was fully formed. It says rule didn't slowly develop through trial and error. It didn't evolve from councils to chieftains to kings. It was lowered from heaven as a complete institution. And the first place it settled was Eridu, far south, near what would have been the ancient Persian Gulf coastline. Archaeology backs up something here that's honestly unsettling. Eridu really is among the oldest continuously inhabited sites in Mesopotamia. Temple structures there go back incredibly far, into the 6th millennium BC, long before the famous empires, long before the big names most people recognize. In Sumerian cosmology, Eridu wasn't just old, it was first. It belonged to Enki, the god of freshwater, wisdom, and primordial magic. His temple complex, Iabzu, was positioned over the Abzu, the subterranean sweetwater ocean the Sumerians believed sustained life itself. So in their minds, Eridu wasn't just an early city. It was a cosmic contact point. a place where divine order touched earth, a thin boundary, a hinge, and that, the King List tells us, is exactly where kingship landed when it descended. Now, scholars have tried to explain the reign lengths in 100 ways. Maybe they represent dynasties, not individuals. Maybe the numbers encode astronomical cycles. Maybe years mean something different, months, seasons, symbolic units. Maybe this is mythic time, not historical time. All of those theories are interesting, and we'll get into them later. But what they all quietly admit is the same uncomfortable truth. The Sumerians did not treat the first bearers of kingship as ordinary human rulers. Something about these figures, their nature, their relationship to time, their role, was categorically different from the kings who came after. Because according to Sumerian tradition, the world those first rulers governed wasn't finished. Creation had happened, yes, but reality was still stabilizing, still settling into the patterns that would govern the world we recognize as history. Heaven and earth had been separated, torn apart, but the separation was recent, still permeable, still unstable, still needing reinforcement in that transitional epoch. Kingship wasn't just politics, it was cosmic maintenance. The earliest rulers weren't just managing people. They were mediating between divine intention and terrestrial existence, holding order steady in a reality that wasn't fully fixed yet. And then, after listing 5 cities that received kingship before the flood, Eridu, Bad Tibura, Larik, Sippar, Shurapak, the King List drops one of the bluntest, most devastating lines in ancient literature. Then the flood swept over. No warning, no explanation, no speech, just a clean rupture. Everything before that line, those impossibly long reigns, those early cities, those rulers who feel like they embody kingship rather than merely hold it, ends. And when kingship returns after the waters recede, it returns changed, diminished, mortal. Post-flood dynasties, Kish, Uruk, and the rest, still claim divine mandate. They still speak the language of sacred kingship. But their reigns are now measured in decades, not millennia. They die. They get overthrown. They fight wars. They build monuments to shore up shaky legitimacy. Kingship survives, but something essential about its nature does not. And that sets up the question that's going to guide this entire series. If kingship had to descend from heaven, because it couldn't originate on earth, what made the first rulers fit to receive it? Now, let's bring in one of the most important objects in this entire story, the well-Blundell prism. It sits today in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and it's one of the most complete surviving copies of the Sumerian King List. It's not huge, only about 8 inches tall, but it contains an enormous claim. Its neat columns document dynasty after dynasty, from the beginning of time down to the scribe's present day, and the opening lines hit like ice water. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was an Eridu. Notice the verb, lowered, not invented, not negotiated, not developed, lowered. The Sumerian phrasing implies a physical action, setting something down from above. The same kind of verb used for replacing sacred objects into shrines with ritual precision. This isn't casual poetry. This reads like cosmological mechanics. And when you realize that this document wasn't just literature, but political infrastructure, something later kings lean on to justify their rule, then the implications start to feel heavier. Because if the institution of kingship is treated as a divine transfer, not a human invention, then the first rulers aren't simply ancient kings. There's something closer to an interface, a bridge, a category of being that belongs to a world where heaven and earth are still too close together. And next, we'll take a closer look at the pre-flood numbers, why they were constructed based on precise mathematical models, why ancient chroniclers preserved them even when they knew they were strange, and what those numbers might tell us about the pre-flood period itself. So let's stay with that discomfort for a second, the feeling that we're not just reading myths, but reading something that was treated as official memory, copied like law, preserved like a foundation. Because once you accept that the Sumerian King List wasn't written as entertainment, the numbers stop being a quirky detail and start becoming the main problem. 8 kings, 5 cities, a total reign length of 241,200 years. And the text reports it the way a modern record might report tax receipts. Calm, flat, confident, like it expects you to understand what it means. Now, one of the most fascinating pieces of evidence here isn't even the King List itself. It's the behavior of the scribes who copied it. In 1923, a University of Pennsylvania expedition uncovered a damaged tablet from the poor, cataloged as NI 3191, dating to around 2000 BC. It contained yet another copy of the Sumerian King List, but with something extra: marginal notes. Little scribal annotations, added later in smaller writing. The scribe had been bothered by the rain lengths. Not bothered enough to fix them, not bold enough to reject them, but bothered enough to add a comment acknowledging what everyone could see, that these rains belonged to a different kind of time. The phrase he used is translated as something like days without measure, a kind of time that shows up elsewhere in Sumerian literature when they describe mythic epics. Not ordinary years, not human time, a different order altogether. And that detail matters because it tells us something crucial. Even ancient scribes recognized the antediluvian kings as anomalous and still preserved them with extreme care, which means the anomaly was part of the message. Now, let's lay the 8 names out clearly, because this list gets blurred in a lot of retellings. And the details are important. Alulem ruled Eridu for 28,800 years. Alauga ruled Eridu for 36,000 years. Enmenluana ruled Bad Tibber for 43,200 years. Enmengalana ruled Bad Tibber for 28,800 years. Demuzid ruled Bad Tibber for 36,000 years. Ensipedzadana ruled Larik for 28,800 years. Enmendurana ruled Sapar for 21,000 years. Ubertutu ruled Shirapak for 18,600 years. The numbers aren't random. They're not messy. They're patterned, structured, and deeply tied to the Sumerian base 60 system, what scholars call the sexagesimal system. You probably heard that base. 60 is why we have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. That tradition doesn't come from nowhere. Mesopotamia lived inside that number system. And in the King List, the reign lengths tend to land on multiples of 3,600, because 3,600 is a huge unit in their counting system, almost like a cosmic block of time. So already, the list looks like it's operating with a different measuring stick. It's political record-keeping, written in a language of cosmic math. Now, at this point, most people want a quick escape hatch. They want someone to say, "Oh, it's symbolic," and close the book. But scholars can't quite do that, because the King List mixes these antediluvian reigns with dynasties we can cross-check. It lists real cities, real places. It transitions into reign lengths that, while sometimes exaggerated, fall into ranges that are at least within the realm of ancient royal propaganda. And that creates a problem. The text doesn't signal a genre shift. It doesn't tell you, now we're doing mythology. It just keeps going. So academics have proposed 3 broad explanations, and we should actually walk through them, because what's interesting isn't just what these theories say, it's what they don't solve. First, the dynasty theory. This idea suggests the names aren't individuals. They're dynastic titles. So Alulem's 28,800 years might represent a long stretch of leadership under a line that used the same throne name, kind of like how Pharaoh becomes less a person and more a role, or how Caesar turns into a title that outlives the man. It's plausible. In Mesopotamia, royal names often signaled office as much as identity. But there's a problem. The King List uses singular grammar for these rulers. It presents them like discrete figures, one after another, with reigns assigned to individuals, not collections. If it meant dynasties, it's weird that it doesn't talk like it means dynasties. Second, the astronomical encoding theory. This one points out that the numbers line up suspiciously well with astronomical cycles and mathematical structure. For example, the total 241,200 years can be expressed neatly in terms of those big base 60 units. So maybe the King List is encoding celestial knowledge, precessions, long cycles, cosmic periods, stuff priest astronomers would have tracked. But there's a problem here too. The text doesn't present the numbers as symbolic or astronomical. It presents them as political chronology. It anchors them to cities and succession. It doesn't read like an astrology chart. It reads like a king list. Third, the mythic time theory. This one takes the scribes at their word. Before the flood, time itself operated differently. Not that humans literally lived 43,200 years in the biological sense, but that the antediluvian world belongs to another temporal framework. Sacred time, cosmic time, the kind of time myths happen inside. This theory doesn't explain away the numbers. It accepts them as accurate within the reality the texts describe. And honestly, it fits the internal logic best. Because the King List isn't just saying the past was longer. It's saying the past was different. A world where the rules weren't the same. Now here's what scholars generally agree on, even across disagreements. These figures weren't invented casually. They appear consistently across major manuscripts spanning centuries, different scribal schools, different political climates. Yet the core sequence remained stable, which means whatever these numbers meant, their meaning was understood as authoritative. So then we should look at the names themselves, because the names are another quiet clue. A lot of these rulers have names that sound less like Bob, king of Eridu, and more like titles, cosmic functions. Take Enmendarana, for example. Later Mesopotamian tradition remembers a figure named Enmedaranki as a kind of pre-flood master of sacred knowledge, the one taught by the gods, the one given secret tablets, the one who passed down the art of divination. That's not a normal king story. That's a bridge story, a mediator, a transmitter, and even the structure of the names matters. You keep seeing N, a term tied to priestly authority, sacred office, embodiment of divine order. Which brings us to something even more revealing than the numbers, the language of rulership itself. Sumerian preserved multiple words for ruler, and they weren't interchangeable. This is one of the earliest terms. It's tied to the concept of me, those fundamental decrees of reality, the divine ordinances that define how things function. And it isn't primarily a military leader. An is someone who embodies an ordinance, someone positioned correctly to manifest a divine principle on earth. The high priestess of Inanna at Uruk held the title N in certain contexts. Early rulers of Eridu bear this kind of sacred framing. Lugul, this term appears later, around the early dynastic period. It literally means something like great man or big man, and you can feel the shift instantly. This is kingship as human strength, human leadership, human command. Luguls build armies. Luguls conquer. Luguls negotiate, intimidate, expand. This is kingship as political office. Ensi, this is more like a governor, a city ruler administering on behalf of a higher authority, either a greater king or directly under a city's patron god. So when you map these terms onto the King List story, the shape becomes clear. The antediluvian rulers look like N figures, cosmic stewards, sacred embodiments. Post-flood kings begin to look more like Lugul figures, human rulers operating through force, organization, achievement. And that shift matches what we actually see in archaeology. In the earlier Ubaid settlements, you find temples and coordinated planning, but not the heavy fingerprints of coercive state machinery, not massive fortifications, not the kind of militarized palace culture that shows up later. In later periods, you start seeing walls, weapon stockpiles, administrative archives tracking tribute, labor, taxation. It's as if kingship becomes more visibly human as time moves forward, which makes the antediluvian problem even sharper. If the first kings aren't described as war leaders, lawgivers, conquerors, what were they doing for 28,800 years? And the texts hint at an answer. They weren't ruling in the modern sense. They were maintaining, anchoring, performing cosmic functions through ritual presence. There's a reason later kings, even when they're bragging about conquest, still obsess over temple building and sacred duty. They're trying to inherit a type of legitimacy that originally wasn't based on military success. Take the Stele of Ur-Nemu, around 2100 BC. It depicts the king not as a battlefield hero, but as a builder, a ritual figure, presenting himself before the gods, holding tools, pouring libations. He's called a shepherd, a caretaker, a maintainer of divine order. And by his time, that framing is already partly nostalgia, because kingship has become political, competitive, mortal. But the posture on the steel reaches backward toward an older idea, kingship as cosmic mediation. So when the King List tells us these early rulers reigned through epochs we can't biologically account for, maybe it's not asking us to imagine an old man on a throne living for 40,000 years. Maybe it's describing a category of authority that doesn't map neatly onto human lifespan, a type of being or a type of office that belongs to mythic time and operates under different rules. And that brings us right up to the edge of the flood again. Because if the antediluvian kings were maintaining cosmic order, embodying it, anchoring it, then the flood wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a collapse of the system they were built for. To really understand why the Sumerian King List opens the way it does, kingship lower from heaven, reign stretching into the tens of thousands, we have to do something that feels strange to modern instincts. We have to stop treating their creation stories as decorative mythology and start treating them like the framework the Sumerians used to explain how reality itself works. Because in their world, kingship isn't just a political tool. It's a cosmic mechanism. And if the cosmos in the beginning wasn't stable, then the earliest rulers couldn't be ordinary. They would have needed to be something suited to an unfinished world. One of the oldest texts we have that preserves this worldview is what scholars call the Eridu Genesis. The surviving tablet we have was written down much later, around 1600 BC, but it's clearly preserving traditions far older than the clay itself. It was excavated from the poor, and it's damaged, crumbled edges, missing sections, whole lines lost like torn pages from a book. But what survives is enough to feel the shape of the original idea. Creation, in these traditions, is not a single moment where everything appears complete and polished. Creation is an ongoing process. Reality comes into being in phases, and early on it isn't finished. It isn't hardened into the stable structure we take for granted. The text opens with an image that feels almost hypnotic. Before cities, before temples, before even names were fixed, there was only Namu, not a goddess who makes things the way we imagine creator, but the primordial sea itself. Undifferentiated potential, a state where everything exists as possibility, but nothing exists as form. No categories, no boundaries, no separation, just a deep, endless before. From Namu comes the first differentiation, and representing heaven, and Ki, embodying earth. But in the earliest phase, even in Ki aren't properly separate. The texts are explicit about this in a way that modern retellings often soften. Heaven and earth begin pressed together, fused into a single compressed unity, what they describe as a cosmic mountain, the primal and Ki. No space between sky and ground, no air, no middle realm, no place for human life to exist the way we understand human life. Just potential, packed tight, waiting for something violent enough to split it open. That violence comes through Enlil, the storm god, Lord Air. The myths describe Enlil forcing his way between heaven and earth, literally tearing his parents apart, and is lifted upward. Ki is pushed downward, and the space between them becomes the atmosphere, the middle realm, the field where the human world can finally appear. That separation is the foundation of the cosmic order. But here's the detail that matters most for what we're doing tonight. In the Sumerian imagination, this separation wasn't ancient beyond memory. It was recent in cosmic terms, fresh, and, most importantly, not automatically permanent. Some versions of the tradition preserve the idea that Enlil didn't just separate heaven and earth once and walk away. He had to keep reinforcing the division, preventing them from collapsing back into unity. The boundary needed maintenance. So let that settle. If the structure of existence required maintenance, if heaven and earth could drift back together, if reality could slump back toward undifferentiated chaos, then governance, in that earliest phase, wouldn't be about taxes, borders, or armies. It would be about keeping the cosmos upright, holding the world in the configuration it needed to stay livable. And once you see that, the King List becomes less like fantasy and more like a record written in a different logic, because it places its earliest rulers exactly in that transitional zone, after separation but before stabilization, after creation begins, but before creation is complete. A world where the divine and terrestrial are still too close, still permeable, still bleeding into each other. And kingship in that world would not be a human invention. It would be part of the architecture, a method the gods used to anchor their order into material world. This is why the King List treats the first rulers differently, not only by giving them impossible reign lengths, but by describing their era as if it belongs to a different kind of time. A kind of time where the line between divine action and human action hasn't fully hardened into separate categories yet. Sumerian literature even has language for this. In those days' world, the mythic epic where events don't recede into the past the way they do for us. They remain present, accessible, renewable through ritual and memory. In that framework, the earliest kings aren't measured the way later kings are measured. They're not counted like mortal rulers ticking down toward death. They're measured like phases, like cosmic assignments. Like someone is saying, for this long, reality needed this kind of maintenance in this place. Then it moved to the next place, and the next. Now, what's eerie is how often the physical evidence seems to echo the shape of that story, without proving it, without validating it literally, but echoing it enough to keep you uneasy. Consider the Ubaid period, roughly 5500 to 4000 BC. This is when permanent settlements spread and temples begin appearing in southern Mesopotamia, exactly in the region the King List names first. And when archaeologists excavate Eridu, what do they find? Not a single early shrine that slowly grows into something impressive. Not a messy timeline of experimentation, but a sequence of 18 successive temple structures built directly on top of each other, stretching over an enormous span of time. And what's remarkable is how consistent the pattern is. Rebuilt again and again in the same orientation, maintaining the same basic sacred geometry, as if the city was guarding a template, as if there was a right way the structure had to remain, not because it looked nice, but because it mattered, because it was doing something. In later ages, kings build temples to show power, to prove devotion, to impress rivals, to mark their names into stone. But in these earliest sequences, what you see feels different. It doesn't read like ego. It reads like maintenance, like someone is repeatedly restoring an essential piece of infrastructure. And then you have to ask the question the King List quietly forces on you. Who maintained that pattern? Who ensured continuity over spans so long that individual human lifetimes become almost irrelevant? The King List answer, whether you accept it or not, is that the earliest rulers operated under different temporal rules. Their reign spanned what looks like impossible time because their function wasn't politics. It was stabilization. It was anchoring a world still settling. This also helps explain another strange feature of the antediluvian era, the absence of what we associate with state power. In the archaeology of those early settlements, you don't see obvious evidence of massive coercive infrastructure, not giant fortification walls, not clear military apparatus, not the heavy fingerprints of a fully formed state. You see planning, you see temples, you see centralized coordination, but not necessarily the machinery of domination. Almost as if, in that early phase, order is upheld not by force, but by sacred alignment, by correctly positioned spaces, correctly performed rituals, correctly maintained patterns that keep the cosmic boundary stable. And that brings us right back to the King List's opening claim. Kingship was lowered from heaven. In this framework, kingship isn't invented because humans need help managing conflict. Kingship is installed because the cosmos needs an anchor point, something to hold order in the material world while creation finishes stabilizing. And that's why the antediluvian kings look like something between. Not gods, because gods don't drown in floods. But not fully human either, because they rule through mythic epics, embedded in a world where heaven and earth are still too close, still not fully sealed apart. They are transitional authorities for a transitional reality, which is why the flood matters so much. Because the flood isn't merely water destroying cities. In these texts, it's the event that closes the permeable boundary, the event that collapses mythic time into historical time, the moment when the world is forced into its final configuration. Permanent separation, fixed rules, human limitation. And if that's true, then the flood didn't just kill people. It ended a category of existence. There's a reason the Sumerian King List hits harder than most flood myths. It doesn't dramatize. It doesn't build tension. It doesn't give speeches or moral warnings or tragic scenes of people begging the gods to stop the waters. It just states it. After 8 kings across 5 cities, after 241,200 years of reigns that don't behave like human lifespans, the text drops a line so blunt it feels like a blade. Then the flood swept over. That's it. No explanation. No justification. No grieving. Just a clean boundary marker, like a geological layer in stone, like a line in the earth separating one era from another. And that restraint is what makes it so unsettling, because it reads like the King List isn't trying to tell a story. It's documenting a transition between 2 different kinds of reality. Everything before that line belongs to one order. Everything after belongs to another. Now, when we step outside the King List and look at other Mesopotamian texts, the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, later the Epic of Gilgamesh, we do get more context. But that context makes the flood feel even bigger, not smaller. Because in these stories, the flood isn't just weather. It isn't heavy rain. It isn't even a regional disaster. It's cosmic correction, a reset, a violent reimposition of the boundary between divine and human realms. In the Eridu Genesis tradition, the gods decide to send the flood. And in one version of the reasoning, it's not that humanity is morally evil the way later traditions frame it. It's that humanity has become too loud. Too many settlements. Too much noise. Too much disturbance. And the god Enlil, the same figure who separated heaven and earth, becomes the one who demands a reset. That detail matters. Because Enlil isn't just a god with a temper. Enlil is the guardian of cosmic order. He's associated with boundaries, especially the boundary that makes life possible, the separation of realms. So if the flood is correction, then what's being corrected? According to Atrahasis, humanity multiplied, cities grew, activity intensified, and this proliferation wasn't just a social issue. It was cosmological. It threatened the balance. It destabilized the structure. In other words, the world drifted. It leaned too far toward disorder, toward boundary collapse, toward the divine and mortal becoming entangled in ways that weren't sustainable. And the flood, in that logic, isn't punishment. It's maintenance. A brutal form of maintenance. A forced reset of the system. Now here's where it gets even darker. In these accounts, the catastrophe targets cities. The waters don't just wipe out individuals. They erase the antediluvian order itself. Shurpak, Eridu, Bad Tibra, Sapar, these are the names that keep showing up. They aren't random. They are the network nodes of the pre-flood world. They are sacred geography, cosmic infrastructure. So when the flood comes, it's like someone is ripping out the circuitry, destroying the physical anchors, collapsing the system those cities embodied. The Atrahasis epic describes a flood with a kind of mechanical precision. Dikes breaking, storm gods releasing rains, subterranean waters erupting upward. And the most chilling image is that the waters from below, the Abzu, and the waters from above, the sea and storm, mix together. That mixing is symbolic, yes, but it's also cosmological in Mesopotamian thought, because the cosmos is layered. Waters below, earth in the middle, heaven above. The flood isn't just water covering land. It's the collapse of the cosmic layers back toward primordial unity, a temporary return to Namu, the undifferentiated state, before creation stabilizes. For 7 days and 7 nights, the world returns to a pre-creation condition, and then it reforms. But the reform isn't a simple restoration of the old order. It's a final configuration, a sealing, a permanent separation, which is why, in the King List, the flood isn't treated like a dramatic episode. It's treated like the switch that changes the operating system. And once that switch flips, kingship itself changes. Because after, then the flood swept over. The King List resumes with a line that mirrors the opening. After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Read that carefully. Kingship descended again, which means kingship wasn't simply carried through by survivors as a human tradition. It had to be reinstalled, relowered, almost like the flood wiped the slate clean, and the institution had to be transferred again under new conditions. But now it's in Kish, not Eridu, not any of the 5 sacred pre-flood cities. Kish is in northern Babylonia. It's not part of the old antediluvian network in the King List framing. Kingship begins again somewhere new, somewhere that feels less like a cosmic hinge and more like a human political center. And that relocation tells us something. The old network was gone. The old system was erased. The old sacred geography, those 5 city nodes, was no longer the framework. So kingship returns, but it returns into a world that has shifted. And the numbers show the shift immediately. The first post-flood ruler of Kish is listed at 1,200 years. Still huge, still beyond normal biology, but nowhere near 28,800 or 43,200. The scale collapses by orders of magnitude. As the list continues, reign lengths drop further and further, toward ranges that look like propaganda, but still feel human. Centuries, then decades. By the time you reach figures like Gilgamesh, reign lengths fall into the realm of legendary human, not cosmic epic. So something fundamental changed, not just society, but time, or at least the way time operates for rulers, or the way authority is measured. And the King List draws a hard line. The flood is the boundary. Now here's an eerie detail. In the later flood traditions, the one survivor is a Usadra in Sumerian sources, Atrahasis is an Akkadian, Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh version. He's warned. He builds a boat. He saves a remnant. But notice who doesn't survive in the narratives. The antediluvian kings. Alulim, Alaugr, Enmenluana, Enmendurana, Ubertutu, the last pre-flood ruler, in fact. His name is the father of Usadra in some traditions, and yet the kings themselves vanish. The texts don't linger on their deaths. They aren't immortalized as post-flood sages. They aren't carried forward as ancient ancestors. They disappear completely. As if the flood didn't merely kill them, it eliminated the category of being they represented. And that would make sense if those rulers were transitional authorities tied to a transitional world. Because if the flood permanently seals the boundary between heaven and earth, then you no longer need beings who exist between realms. You no longer need rulers operating in mythic time. You no longer need cosmic maintenance kings, because the cosmos has been forced into a stable configuration that can hold itself without that kind of direct mediation. And the survivor, Usadra, can't remain normal afterward. The stories often say he's granted immortality, taken to a distant place at the mouth of the rivers, removed from ordinary human life. That detail is telling. Even the one human who crosses the boundary can't return unchanged. He must become something else, or be taken out of the human world entirely. Crossing the cosmic reset requires transformation. Meanwhile, the antediluvian kings are simply gone, and that silence is heavy. Now, there's another dimension here that complicates things even more. Archaeology. Mesopotamia is a landscape built by rivers. Flooding is normal. It's part of life. But excavations at sites like Shurapak have revealed thick flood layers, catastrophic disruptions between earlier settlement phases and later dynastic ones. Different sites show evidence of different floods at different times, meaning there probably wasn't a single global flood in the geological sense. But that's not what the texts are trying to tell us anyway. The point is, the people living there experienced severe water catastrophes that were memory-shaping. Floods that broke continuity. Floods that felt like the end of a world. And those disruptions could easily become the historical seed around which a cosmic story grows. A story that isn't only about water, but about the transition from one kind of world to another. So by the time the King List is compiled and copied, the flood becomes more than an event. It becomes the boundary. The place where mythic time ends and historical time begins. The place where kingship stops being cosmic function and becomes human office. Which brings us to the most important question of this section. If kingship survived the flood but returned diminished, if it had to descend again, but now into a world where rulers die, compete, fight wars, and cling to legitimacy, then what was lost in that transition? What capability vanished? What connection closed? What aspect of authority could never be recovered? Because the king list isn't subtle about one thing. Kingship after the flood is unstable. It becomes contested. Cities fight over it. Dynasties rise and collapse. Military defeat transfers authority from one place to another. That's the world we recognize as history. But the world before the flood, the king list presented as stable, sequential, almost ritual. Kingship moved city to city like a planned procession, not like a prize seized in war. So the flood isn't just a flood. It's the moment authority becomes fragile. It's the moment legitimacy becomes a problem humans have to solve through effort rather than inheriting it as cosmic structure. So when kingship comes back after the flood, it comes back into a different world. Same word, kingship. Same claim, descended from heaven. But everything about how it behaves feels smaller, heavier, more fragile. The king list says it plainly. After the flood, kingship isn't Kish. And immediately, the reigns shrink. Still long, still exaggerated by our standards, but no longer cosmic. We move from 28,843,200 years down to 1,200, then 960, then 420, then lower. It's not just a reduction in numbers. It's a reduction in scale, as if time itself tightens, as if the rulers are no longer operating inside mythic time, but inside something closer to human time. Legendary, stretched, but recognizable. And then the king list changes its behavior in another way that people don't always notice on a first reading. Before the flood, the list is smooth, clean, almost ceremonial. 8 kings, 5 cities, one after another, no drama. It doesn't tell you about wars. It doesn't tell you about rival claimants. It doesn't tell you about dynasties collapsing. Kingship transfers like a cosmic baton. But after the flood, the list starts sounding like history. Now it mentions conflict. Now it records defeat. Now kingship isn't simply located somewhere it gets taken. The language becomes competitive. Power shifts because one city overthrows another. A dynasty ends because it loses. And once you see that, you realize the flood didn't just change reign lengths. It changed the entire physics of authority. Because in the post-flood world, kingship becomes something that has to be maintained through human means, through force, through administration, through law, through propaganda, through monuments, through constant effort. And that's why, once we move forward into dynasties like Uruk, Uar, and later Akkad, we start seeing kings described in ways that are almost completely absent from the antediluvian era. They don't just reign. They conquer. They fortify. They campaign. They build walls. They seize canals. They punish enemies. They count victories. They brag, which tells us something simple but profound. Kingship after the flood has to prove itself. Before the flood, at least in the king list framing, kingship seems self-evident. It exists as part of the world structure. After the flood, kingship becomes an argument, a performance, a thing that can be challenged. And that's why the king list suddenly becomes obsessed with transfer. Kish holds kingship, then it moves. Uruk holds kingship, then it moves. Uar holds kingship, then it moves. And the mechanism isn't cosmic relocation. It's conquest and collapse. So here's the question. What exactly was lost? Because if kingship was once a cosmic function, anchoring order, then the post-flood world looks like the moment humans inherit authority, without the original cosmic framework that made it effortless. And once humans inherit it, the work begins. That's where law codes enter the story. This is so important, and it's easy to miss if you're thinking like a modern person. We tend to see early law codes as a triumph. Civilization becoming rational, society becoming organized, justice becoming structured. But in the world the king list implies, law codes are also a symptom. Written law becomes necessary when authority is no longer embodied, when order no longer exists automatically as a cosmic structure, when humans have to negotiate and enforce what used to be maintained by sacred alignment. The earliest known law code we have is associated with Uarnemu, around 2100 BC, and the opening of that code is revealing. Uarnemu doesn't speak like someone who is divine order. He speaks like someone authorized by it. He positions himself carefully. The gods turned over kingship. They handed it down. And by their might, he establishes equity in the land. That phrasing matters. It's kingship as delegation, not kingship as embodiment. Uarnemu has to create equity. It doesn't radiate naturally from his presence. He has to establish it. He has to enforce it. And that means the world has changed. Because in the antediluvian framing, those rulers don't need law codes. There's no list of rules. No bureaucratic legal apparatus. Their authority is described like a cosmic condition, not a human project. But now, after the flood, the king is a human being with a job. He must decide. He must judge. He must punish. He must build a machinery that makes social order possible. And as history moves forward, that machinery expands massively. By the time you reach Hammurabi around 1750 BC, the transformation is almost complete. Hammurabi still claims divine mandate, of course. He says the gods chose him, commissioned him, charged him with bringing righteousness. But then he follows that sacred framing with something intensely human. Hundreds of specific laws, numbered, detailed, covering property, trade, assault, marriage, debt, labor, everything. Divine order translated into bureaucratic specification. And that's what kingship becomes in the post-flood world, a constant attempt to compress the complexity of reality into human manageable systems. It's an endless effort to recreate through organization what the antediluvian world supposedly had by structure. And you can see it physically in the archaeological record. As you move into the early dynastic period and beyond, you start seeing palaces as separate institutions. You start seeing fortified walls. You start seeing archives, rooms filled with clay tablets tracking receipts, labor assignments, tribute payments, diplomatic correspondence. You start seeing the material footprint of administration. And here's the key. You see that footprint grow as kingship becomes more human, because bureaucracy proliferates when authority stops being self-evident. You need accountants when resources don't simply flow through sacred order. You need officials when labor has to be organized and coerced. You need written records when legitimacy can be questioned. You need armies when power can be seized. The antediluvian world, as described by the King List, doesn't require any of that, but the post-flood world does. Which is why the King List starts reading like an endless cycle of conflict. Cities don't just exist as cooperative nodes of sacred geography anymore. They compete, they raid, they fight, they collapse. And kingship becomes a prize passed through violence. This is where you start encountering figures like Lugal-Zaggisi, who claims to have conquered dozens of cities. Then Sargon of Akkad, who overthrows rivals and builds a first empire. Then Naram-Sin, who pushes even further, declaring himself divine, almost like a desperate attempt to reclaim what earlier rulers possessed naturally. And then the cycle continues. Invasion, collapse, restoration, collapse again. The Gudians bring Akkad down. Uarnemu rebuilds. Shoji campaigns. Walls rise. Canals are dug. Armies march. And it never stops, because power is no longer a cosmic condition. It's a human struggle. So when modern history tells a story of progress, we have to notice what the Sumerian King List quietly suggests underneath. What if what we call progress is also decline? Not moral decline, structural decline. From cosmic permanence to human instability. From sacred embodiment to administrative performance. From mythic time to mortality. Because there's another difference the King List highlights, and it's brutal once you see it. Pre-flood rulers don't die in the text. They simply reign, and kingship transfers. No graves, no endings, but post-flood rulers die constantly. Succession becomes a problem. Dynasties collapse when lines fail. Authority fractures the moment a strong king is gone. Mortality enters politics like a disease. And with mortality comes instability. And with instability comes violence. So the post-flood world is the world we recognize as history. Cause and effect, rise and fall, one dynasty replacing another. History begins exactly where divinity withdraws, exactly where kingship becomes fully human, which leads to the quiet, haunting question at the center of all this. If human kingship is what remains after something larger is lost, If all our political sophistication is built as compensation for a broken cosmic framework, then what exactly did the flood sever? What connection closed? What kind of authority vanished? To understand what the flood destroyed, what kingship lost, we have to go back to the part of the story that's easiest to treat like a simple list. Those 5 pre-flood cities. Because if you read the King List quickly, they can feel like background scenery. Place names, a sequence. But in the Sumerian imagination, cities aren't just places where people live. Cities are nodes. They're cosmic stations. They're points where divine order can anchor into material world. And that's why the King List doesn't describe these cities as founded. It doesn't tell you humans gathered and built them out of necessity. It treats them like they already exist, as if they were waiting for kingship to arrive. Eridu, Bad Tibra, Larik, Sapar, Shurapak, 5 cities that received kingship before the flood. 5 cities that represent the antediluvian order itself. And what's eerie is that when you look at archaeology, especially in the far south, you find patterns that almost match that theological framing too well for comfort. Let's start with Eridu, because Eridu is the key, the first city, the first receiver of kingship. In 1946, Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar excavated a site known today as Tel Abu Sharain, the ruins of ancient Eridu. And what he uncovered shouldn't have been normal. According to the simplest models of early urban development, he found 18 successive temple structures built directly on top of each other, spanning from roughly 5400 BC to around 4000 BC. Not scattered little shrines that slowly evolved. Not messy experiments. But sophisticated temples from early on. Structures that look like they're following an established plan, rebuilt again and again with the same orientation and sacred geometry. The earliest phase is already organized, already patterned, already intentional. And when you stand back and look at that, you can't help asking, why such consistency? Because this isn't just construction. It's preservation. It's maintenance. It's as if the temple layout wasn't something people were inventing. It was something people were protecting. And that aligns disturbingly well with Sumerian theology about Eridu. Eridu belonged to Enki, god of the Abzu, fresh water, wisdom, and a deep reservoir of creative magic beneath the world. Enki is the keeper of the me, those fundamental decrees that govern how reality functions, from kingship to craftsmanship to sexuality to ritual. His temple at Eridu is literally named Abzu, House of the Abzu. The structure isn't just a place of worship. It's a cosmic interface, a point where divine potential can rise into the human world. So if kingship is going to descend, if it's going to be lowered like a sacred object, Eridu makes sense in Sumerian terms. It's where reality's foundations are closest to the surface, where divine ordinances can be accessed, where the boundary between realms is thin. Now move to Bad Tibra. Bad Tibra is harder to locate with absolute certainty archaeologically, but its name means something like Fortress of the Metalworkers, and later traditions link it to craft, transformation, and divine smithing. Bad Tibra is where 3 antediluvian kings reign, an enormous concentration in the King List narrative, and that detail alone is meaningful. If Eridu is foundation, Bad Tibra looks like shaping. Reality doesn't just need a base. It needs form. It needs transformation, raw material becoming tools, potential becoming function, the world taking on stable, usable patterns. And in later Mesopotamian thought, that transformative power has a sacred dimension. Craft isn't just work. It's part of creation continuing. Bad Tibra's patron associations connect with Demusid, a figure whose mythology revolves around fertility, seasonal cycles, death and renewal, the rhythms that make life sustainable. So again, the city isn't merely a settlement. It represents a cosmic function. Transformation, renewal, the shaping of reality into stable cycles. Then we get to Larik. Larik is archaeologically elusive. Its exact location isn't securely identified, though texts place it somewhere in the southern Mesopotamian landscape, near marshlands. But the King List gives Larik a single antediluvian ruler, Ensepitzadana, who reigns for 28,800 years. And its patron deity is often associated with Pabalag, a warrior figure tied to both plague and healing. Two forces that seem opposite but are actually linked in ancient thought: disruption and restoration, damage and recovery, the power to wound and the power to set right. And if you think of early reality as unstable, as vulnerable, then you can see why a defense phase might matter. A cosmos learning to resist collapse. A world developing mechanisms for correction. A way to fight disorder without reverting entirely back to primordial chaos. Lyric, in that framework, becomes a node of resistance and repair. Then we move northward to Sapar. Sapar we can identify archaeologically with much more confidence. It's in northern Babylonia, and it belonged to Utu, the sun god, light, justice, revealed truth. Sapar becomes famous later as a center of learning, law, and divination, and the King List places Enmen-Durana there, ruling for 21,000 years. This is the same figure later traditions remember as the one taught sacred knowledge by the gods, tablets of heaven, omen reading, the art of interpreting signs. So Sapar's role in the network is clear revelation, illumination, the transmission of knowledge necessary for humans to navigate a world now moving toward historical time. Because once the divine-human boundary begins sealing, communication becomes harder. You need omens. You need interpretation. You need systems. You need a way to read the divine will indirectly. Sapar, as a node of solar clarity and sacred law, fits that perfectly. And finally, we reach Shurapak, the fifth pre-flood city. Shurapak is crucial because it's the last city in the antediluvian sequence, where Ubuntu reigned for 18,600 years. Shurapak is also directly tied to flood tradition. In later accounts, Shurapak is a home of the flood survivor, Zayusadra. And archaeologically, Shurapak is one of the sites where excavators found significant flood layer, evidence of catastrophic inundation interrupting settlement continuity. Again, this doesn't prove the myth in a literal sense, but it gives a memory of physical anchor, a real catastrophe that could become a civilizational boundary marker. Now step back and look at the five cities together. They spread from the deep south northward. Eridu at the far edge, near the ancient coastline. Then Bad Tibra. Then Lyric. Then Sapar. Then Shurapak. It's not a random scatter. It looks like expansion, like a deliberate unfolding of sacred geography across the landscape, almost like the King List is mapping the spread of cosmic order into the world, placing nodes where divine and terrestrial realms interact correctly. And notice what's missing from the antediluvian framing. No wars between these cities. No competition for kingship. No conquest narratives. They aren't rivals. They're parts of a system. Each has a patron deity. Each has a role. Each receives kingship for a time, then yields it, as if the transfer is planned, necessary, almost ritual. That's very different from later Mesopotamian city history. Later cities compete brutally. Lagash and Umma fight over irrigation rights and farmland. Uruk rises through power and expansion. Akkad builds empire through conquest. Walls, armies, raids, alliances, betrayals. Pure human politics. But the antediluvian cities in the King List don't feel political. They feel infrastructural, cosmic infrastructure. And this is where the temple evidence at Eridu becomes even more haunting. Because if you take the Sumerian worldview seriously, those temples aren't monuments of human pride. They're maintenance stations. They're like support pillars holding up the architecture of reality. And if you alter them, you destabilize what depends on them, which could explain why the pattern is maintained with such stubborn consistency. Now, if that's the pre-flood world, if these five cities are the nodes of a sacred network maintaining the boundary between realms, then the flood isn't just water wiping out towns. It's the destruction of the network. It's the erasure of the system. It's the collapse of the infrastructure that allowed kingship to function as cosmic maintenance. And that helps explain why the King List treats the flood like a hard boundary rather than a dramatic plot point. Because it's not the end of a story. It's the end of a configuration of reality. After flood, kingship returns, but now it returns into a world without that network, without that sacred geography, without those original nodes. It relocates to Kish. And from there, authority becomes competitive, mortal, unstable. So the five cities taken together are like a map of what was lost. Foundation in Eridu, transformation in Bad Tibera, resistance and repair in Lyric, revelation and interpretation in Sapar, final threshold in Shurapak, and then flood, network erased, system reset. Now here's the question that's going to take us even deeper in Part 7. If the antediluvian world was held stable by a network, cities positioned as cosmic nodes, then kingship wasn't merely rule. It was an installed function. So what exactly were the antediluvian kings doing inside that system? If they weren't war leaders, if they weren't lawgivers, if they weren't administrators in the later sense, what was their actual job? And the answer is going to bring us into the heart of Sumerian kingship as ritual embodiment, where being a ruler isn't about commanding people, but about becoming a living conduit for divine ordinance. So if those 5 cities weren't just settlements, if they were nodes in a sacred network, then we have to face the question that keeps hovering in the background. What exactly were the antediluvian kings doing? Because the king list doesn't describe them the way later kings describe themselves. There's no, I conquered the city. No, I built this wall. No, I dug this canal. No list of enemies defeated or tribute collected. Instead, the king list does something almost eerie in its simplicity. It records their presence, where kingship was, who embodied it, how long that embodiment lasted, and then it moves on. That suggests something important. For the earliest period, existence itself may have been the function. The king didn't need achievements to justify legitimacy, because legitimacy wasn't earned by performance. It was installed by cosmic order. That's hard for modern people to feel, because we're trained to imagine leadership as something you do, policy, enforcement, governance. But in early Mesopotamian thought, kingship is often closer to something you are, a role you embody, a conduit you become. And this is where the language of rulership becomes more than a linguistic detail. It becomes a map. Because in Sumerian, the earliest and most spiritually charged term for ruler is En. And the word En isn't simply king. It's closer to lord in a sacred sense, someone positioned to hold a specific divine ordinance in place. And that connects directly to the concept of me. The me are those fundamental decrees of reality, the divine ordinances that determine how things function. Not just kingship, but everything. Craft, law, fertility, music, mourning, sexuality, temple rites, and social order. In Sumerian thought, the world isn't held together by laws of nature in the modern sense. It's held together by me, patterned ordinances that must be maintained, expressed, and renewed. So, an isn't primarily a political manager. An is a living point of contact between the divine ordinance and the human world. A person whose role is to embody a pattern, so that the pattern remains active in material reality. And if the antediluvian period is the era when reality is still stabilizing, when boundaries are still settling, then the role of the king would naturally lean toward ritual embodiment, not administration, not coercion, but cosmic anchoring. We can actually see echoes of this in later historical kingship, even after everything becomes more political. Take that image we mentioned earlier. You are Namu standing before the gods in temple-building posture. Not throne posture. Not war posture. Ritual posture. He's presenting himself as a maintainer, a shepherd, a caretaker of the divine household. That's not accidental propaganda. It's a cultural memory of what kingship is supposed to be at its deepest level. And in earlier phases, that supposed to be might have been more literal. Because if we look at Sumerian ritual life, we find kingship tied to a set of actions that don't make sense as mere ceremony. They make sense as maintenance. For example, one of the central royal rituals is the sacred marriage, the rite where the king symbolically unites with the goddess, often Inanna, renewing fertility in the land. Modern people tend to hear that and think religious drama or myth acted out. But in Mesopotamian logic, ritual reenactment isn't just symbolism, it's activation. It's a way of keeping the cosmic pattern aligned with the material world. The king isn't pretending to be part of the fertility system. The king is serving as a necessary interface, so that fertility continues to operate correctly. Now imagine that logic amplified in the antediluvian world, when the boundary between heaven and earth is still permeable, when divine patterns aren't fully sealed away, when reality itself still needs reinforcement. In that setting, the king's job could be less like ruling subjects and more like holding a position, maintaining alignment, keeping the channels open. Another clue comes from the way early rulers are remembered in relation to knowledge. Take Enmen-Duran again. Later tradition associates him with divination, the art of reading signs, interpreting omens, understanding the will of the gods through indirect patterns, oil on water, liver marks, celestial movements. That matters because divination, in this worldview, isn't superstition. It's communication across a boundary. It's what humans develop when the boundary becomes less permeable, when direct access fades. So if Enmen-Duran is positioned as a transmitter of divinatory knowledge, then he's not just a ruler. He's a bridge figure, a transitional authority who can receive from the gods and pass to humans, which suggests something else. Kingship and priesthood were not fully separate in this early framing. In fact, they may have been the same thing. Not same job like a modern person might imagine, but the same cosmic category, mediation. In later Mesopotamian society, roles specialize. You get separate priesthoods, scribal schools, palace administration, military command. Temples and palaces become distinct institutions. But in the earliest layers, especially in places like Eridu, the architecture doesn't show a clean separation. Sacred space and administrative space are integrated, which supports the idea that, at the beginning, organizing human life and maintaining divine order were not two separate activities. They were one continuous function. And in that function, the king isn't primarily a lawgiver. He's a stabilizer, a living anchor. Now, this is where a lot of people start asking, okay, but how does that explain the reign lengths? And the answer might be, the reign lengths aren't measuring lifespans. They're measuring tenure of stabilization. How long a particular configuration of divine order needed an embodied anchor before reality could carry that pattern more independently. Think of it like phases in a massive construction process. Foundation, shaping, reinforcement, illumination, threshold. Each phase lasts as long as it needs to. And the King List records those phases as reigns, because kingship is the operative mechanism being installed across the landscape. So when Alulum reigns 28,800 years, the text may not be asking you to imagine one biologically human body surviving almost 30 millennia. It may be telling you, for that long, kingship newly installed remained anchored at Eridu in the foundational node, under the patronage of Enki, while reality's base ordinances stabilized. Then kingship moves and a new phase begins. And this also explains why the reign lengths don't decline smoothly. They fluctuate, because stabilization isn't a straight slide from myth to history. It's uneven. Different phases require different durations. Bad Tibra holds kingship through 3 rulers, as if the transformation phase is long and complex. Sipar's phase is shorter, like illumination is a later refinement rather than an initial requirement. Shurupak's last reign is shorter still, like the system is approaching a threshold, and then flood, reset, boundary sealed. So what does the king actually do in that system? He maintains the ordinances. He performs the rituals that renew the world. He activates sacred space. He keeps the channel between divine decree and terrestrial reality aligned. And most importantly, he occupies a position that makes kingship function at all. That's why later kings obsess over titles like shepherd and builder and servant of the gods. Those aren't just humble words. They're traces of an older kingship model, a model where rule is not primarily domination. It's service, maintenance. And if that sounds strange, here's the most unsettling thought in the whole thing. In the antediluvian framework, subjects might not even exist the way they do later, not as citizens of a state governed through coercion and law. Human society may still be emerging, still not fully autonomous, still structured around temple life rather than palace power, which would mean the king's presence isn't about controlling people. It's about holding the cosmos steady while people learn how to become fully human, fully separated, fully historical, fully mortal. And that would explain why the antediluvian kings vanish after flood. Because once the boundary becomes permanent, the job changes. The world no longer needs embodied cosmic maintenance in the same way. It needs administration, law, force, politics. It needs lugul, not en. Once you understand kingship as cosmic maintenance, once you see the antediluvian rulers as embodiments of divine ordinance, the post-flood world starts to read like a long, haunted aftermath. Because after the flood, kingship returns, but it returns into a world where the old system is gone. The 5-node network is erased. The boundary is sealed. Time feels different. And the kings who come after inherit the institution without inheriting its original operating conditions. So what do? They try to compensate. They try to recreate legitimacy through ritual. They try to rebuild the sense that authority isn't just human power grabbing. They try, again and again, to claw their way back towards something that used to be installed as cosmic structure. And you can feel that struggle in the way later kings talk about themselves. On the surface, Mesopotamian kings present as conquerors, builders, lawgivers. But underneath that, they keep returning to the same obsession. I rule because the gods chose me. I rule because the gods love me. I rule because I'm the shepherd appointed from above. And that obsession makes sense if kingship used to be self-evident, because it was part reality's architecture. After the flood, kingship becomes an argument, and every king knows it. So they build arguments out of stone, out of ritual, out of titles, out of divine language. They overcompensate for a legitimacy that no longer radiates naturally. Nowhere is this clearer than in the transition from end kingship to lugul kingship. Because once kingship becomes fully historical, rulers begin accumulating achievements like armor, walls, canals, temples, military victories, law codes. These things become proof. They're signals that say, I deserve to be here. But notice what that implies. It's no longer enough to exist in the right place with the right sacred alignment. It's no longer enough to be positioned correctly. You have to perform. You have to demonstrate. And that means the old kind of kingship is gone. And yet, kings keep reaching backward. Even when kingship is militarized, it's still framed as sacred. The king isn't just a warlord. He's a ritual figure. He must maintain the gods' houses. He must keep the festivals. He must uphold the cosmic order. But now, the cosmic order doesn't automatically hold. It has to be maintained through effort. And that's why temple building becomes such a royal obsession. In the antediluvian world, temples feel like infrastructure. In the post-flood world, temples become both infrastructure and propaganda. They're still sacred, but they're also statements. Look, the gods are with me. Look, I am restoring what should exist. Look, I am connected. And the desperation gets even clearer when we look at rulers who cross a line. Because some kings don't just claim divine mandate. They claim divinity. They attempt to become what the antediluvian rulers were implied to be. Something between divine and human. The most famous example is Naram-Sin, grandson of Sargon of Akkad. Naram-Sin does something shocking for Mesopotamian tradition. He declares himself a god during his lifetime. Not chosen by the gods. Not beloved of the gods. A god. He wears a horned helmet, the symbol of divinity. He writes inscriptions that treat his authority as sacred in itself. And when you read that through the lens of the King List, it feels less like pure arrogance and more like a symptom. Because what does self-deification look like? It looks like a human ruler trying to manufacture, through language and iconography, what used to exist as a cosmic condition. It's like he's saying, if kingship was once divine in function, then I will make it divine again. But the result isn't stability. It's not cosmic maintenance. It's not effortless legitimacy. It's empire, and empire is unstable. Empire requires constant force, constant campaigning, constant suppression of rebellion. And after Naram-Sin, Akkad collapses under external pressure and internal breakdown, which is exactly what you'd expect of divinity is being performed rather than embodied. It can't hold. It becomes a mass that demands endless reinforcement. Now, let's zoom in even more, because there's a subtle detail in Mesopotamian royal ideology that helps us see this shift clearly. Post-flood kings increasingly describe their role using what we might call task language. They are commissioned. They are appointed. They are given duties. They maintain canals, walls, temples, law. They are managers of complexity. And again, compare that to the antediluvian framing. Those early rulers aren't described as appointed to build a canal. They're described as the ones who held kingship in a city for an epoch. Presence is the action. Tenure is the function. But once kingship becomes human, the king becomes a worker with immense power, yes, but still a worker inside a system of obligations. And that's why kings become obsessed with documenting what they did. They need a record because their legitimacy can be questioned. They need proof because authority doesn't automatically radiate from the structure of reality. And what's fascinating is that the closer a king gets to the post-flood world, chronologically, the more the inscriptions sound like a resume. I built, I conquered, I restored, I dug, I established. This is kingship in historical time, a chain of achievements stacked against mortality. Because now kings die, now dynasties fail, now cities rebel, now kingship transfers through defeat. And kings are terrified of that fragility. So they respond the only way humans can respond. They build permanence. They carve names into stone. They write law codes into stele. They make monuments that outlast their bodies. If you think about it, that's almost the opposite of the antediluvian world. The antediluvian rulers in the King List don't need monuments because their reign lengths themselves are monument enough. Their existence is stretched across epochs, and the list preserves them as a structural foundation. But the post-flood king needs physical permanence because his reign is short. He needs to leave something behind because he cannot endure. And that's why the monumental impulse explodes after the flood boundary. Now here's something else that's quietly devastating. Even the rituals change. The same ceremonies continue. Festival cycles, temple maintenance, sacred marriage rites. But their meaning shifts. They become reenactments of an older reality. They become rehearsals of a connection that isn't as direct anymore. In mythic time, ritual activates reality. In historical time, ritual remembers reality. And that's a subtle but enormous change. It's the difference between turning on a machine and playing a recording of the machine. And that may be why Mesopotamian kingship always carries a sense of longing beneath the violence. A sense that kings are always trying to align themselves to something greater than politics. Because deep in the cultural memory preserved by the King List, kingship wasn't supposed to be politics. It was supposed to be cosmic. Now, take a breath, because this is where things get even more intense. If kingship after the flood is compensation, ritual and monument, and law built to replace lost cosmic structure, then what does that say about human civilization itself? It suggests civilization might be a coping mechanism, not in a weak sense, not as an insult, but in a profound sense. Human complexity as a response to losing direct alignment with a larger order. We become more sophisticated because we have to. We build bureaucracy because we have to. We write laws because we have to. We fight wars because we have to. We are managing power without the original stabilizing framework. And the King List, in its quiet way, documents this as a fall. Not moral, but structural. From a world where authority was installed, to a world where authority must be seized, defended, and justified. From cosmic permanence to historical chaos. From being to doing. From end to lugal. And if that's right, then all those later kings, the ones who call themselves shepherds, builders, chosen ones, even gods, are living in the shadow of memory. A memory of a time when kingship didn't need to prove itself. A time when legitimacy wasn't debated. A time when the boundary between heaven and earth was thin enough that authority could truly be lowered into a city like a sacred object. So now we have to talk about something that's easy to overlook because it feels so mundane. The King List isn't just describing kingship. It's doing kingship. It's not simply a record. It's a political instrument, a legitimizing machine. And that's why it was copied, repaired, preserved, and transmitted for centuries. Because when later kings wanted to prove they had the right to rule, they didn't just point to their armies or their wealth. They pointed backward, to the chain, to the continuity, to the claim that authority was unbroken from the beginning of time. And the King List is a document that makes that claim possible. This is where the king list stops feeling like a curiosity and starts feeling like a kind of weapon. A soft weapon made of clay and ink and ritual authority rather than bronze. But still a weapon, because in Mesopotamia, legitimacy wasn't a philosophical debate. It was survival. If people didn't accept that you had the right to rule, they didn't just criticize you. They rebelled. They allied with your rivals. They sabotaged your projects. They refused your taxes. And in a world where kingship was always contested, legitimacy was the center of gravity. So scribes, those quiet engineers of civilization, became architects of power. They preserved continuity. They built narratives. They curated memory. And the king list is one of their most powerful tools. Think about what the list does structurally. It's not a full history. It doesn't tell stories of personalities, crises, moral lessons, complicated human drama. It's minimalist. It's a chain of names, cities, reign lengths, and transfers. And that minimalism isn't because the scribes were unimaginative. It's because the king list isn't trying to entertain. It's trying to establish a principle. There is one kingship. It moves. It transfers. But it remains singular. It's like a sacred substance passing from city to city, dynasty to dynasty. So when a later king says, "I am king," he's not just claiming dominance. He's claiming that the kingship itself, the one kingship, has landed with him. And if he can anchor his dynasty into the king list, then he's not just a powerful man. He's a continuation of cosmic order. That's the trick. The king list turned political power into inherited metaphysical necessity. Now, this also explains why the king list is selective. It doesn't include every ruler. It doesn't faithfully document every competing local king. It often ignores inconvenient dynasties, compresses messy periods, and smooths over overlaps. Because the point isn't objective history. The point is coherence. The point is making the past look like it has a clean spine. One kingship, one chain, one legitimacy stream. And the scribes were careful about it. Different copies differ in details, but a framework remains stable. That's what mattered. And that's also why the antediluvian kings are so important, because the chain begins with them, which means later legitimacy is ultimately anchored, not merely in ancient ancestors, but in something older than ordinary history, older than war, older than dynastic politics. The chain begins when kingship was lowered from heaven. So if your claim to rule depends on that chain, then your legitimacy ultimately rests on the assumption that kingship is not human invention, it's divine transfer. And it begins with rulers who do not behave like humans. That matters in a way we don't fully feel in modern political thought, because modern legitimacy is usually derived from human processes, elections, inheritance, revolution, law. But in Mesopotamian thought, legitimacy is cosmological. You don't create authority. You receive it. You don't invent kingship. You embody it. And the king list is a document that establishes the origin story of that authority, which means the king list isn't neutral. It's not just saying this happened. It's saying this is what kingship is. So when a later king commissions scribes to copy this list, he's doing something profound. He's attaching himself to a chain that begins before humans. He's claiming to be the inheritor of a heavenly institution. And that claim has real-world consequences. It affects how people obey, how priests cooperate, how cities accept taxation, how rival dynasties frame their own claims. Because political reality in Mesopotamia isn't just built by armies. It's built by narrative structures that are treated as sacred truth. Now, let's look at the well-blundled prism again for a moment. It's a four-sided object, columns of writing, careful, neat, and what it contains is presented as the list. The list is the backbone. It's almost like a constitution, but it's more than that. It's a cosmological constitution, because it doesn't just say who ruled. It says where kingship lives. And that's a weird concept, if you think about it. Kingship isn't described as something humans vote for. It's described as something that is in a city, as if it's a resident force, a sacred presence, a kind of living institution. So kingship is in Eridu, then kingship is in Bad Tibra, then kingship is in Larik, then kingship is in Sapar, then kingship is in Shurapak, then flood, and after the flood, kingship descends again, and now kingship is in Kish. This phrasing turns cities into vessels, containers for authority, and rulers into the current bearer of something larger than themselves, which makes it easy to understand why kingship is treated as transferable like a sacred object, and why conquest in historical time becomes more than taking land. It becomes seizing kingship, capturing the sacred force. Now, here's where things get even more interesting. The King List doesn't just anchor legitimacy in the distant past. It also enforces a particular worldview about the nature of power. It implies that kingship is singular, divinely sourced, and ordered even when real political reality is chaotic. Even when cities overlap and rival kings reign simultaneously. Even when war fragments the region into competing centers of power. The King List smooths it into sequence. One kingship, one chain. That's not historical reporting. That's ideology. And it matters because ideology shapes behavior. If everyone believes kingship is singular and must be in one place, then every city will fight to claim that it is a legitimate seat of kingship, not just a strong city, but the rightful vessel, and that belief fuels conflict. Ironically, the King List may preserve a memory of a stable pre-flood order while helping generate post-flood competition, because once kingship becomes contested, whoever controls the narrative controls legitimacy, and whoever controls legitimacy can mobilize labor, loyalty, and war. So scribes aren't just recording kings. They're shaping political reality. Now, the reason the antediluvian kings remain in the chain, even when later scribes clearly find them puzzling, is that removing them would break the origin claim. If you delete the antediluvian era, kingship no longer begins in heaven. It begins in humans. And that would be catastrophic for a political theology that depends on divine source. So the early rulers remain. The impossible reigns remain. The mythic time remains. Even when scribes add notes like days without measure, because the anomaly is foundational. The weirdness is the point. And the King List forces us into an uncomfortable conclusion. If Mesopotamian legitimacy depends on a chain that begins with rulers who are not fully human, then Mesopotamian kingship is, at its root, a memory of a different order of existence. Whether that order is historical in a literal sense or theological in a mythic sense, it functions the same way. It tells later kings, your authority is not yours. It is received. It is borrowed. It is descended. And therefore your job is not merely to govern, but to maintain the gods' order in the world. Even if, in practice, you're fighting wars and collecting tribute. Even if, in practice, kingship has become human and fragile. The ideology insists that it is still cosmic, which is why later kings cling to ritual and divine language like oxygen, because without it, kingship collapses into pure violence. And pure violence is never stable. Now here's the final, unsettling layer. If the King List is a tool of legitimacy, then it's also a tool of memory. And memory doesn't preserve everything. Memory preserves what a culture needs. So the fact that this document begins with kings who rule for tens of thousands of years tells us something about what the Sumerians and later Mesopotamians needed to believe about their origins. They needed to believe that authority came from beyond the human sphere. That cities were not accidental. That kingship was not invented. That the world had an intended structure. And that structure existed before human struggle began. In other words, they needed to believe that the chaos of historical time was not the original condition. It was a fall. And once you see that, the King List reads like a quiet grief, a record of loss, a preserved memory of a time when legitimacy didn't have to be argued for with armies and law codes and propaganda, a time when kingship was simply installed lower from heaven into a world that still had direct alignment with divine order. So now we're the question that the King List keeps daring us to ask. If the antediluvian kings aren't human, in any normal sense, because their reigns exist in mythic time, then what were they? But also, if they aren't gods, because gods don't drown in floods, then what category is left? What kind of being sits between? This is where Mesopotamian tradition gives us something that feels almost like a missing puzzle piece. The idea of pre-flood intermediaries. Figures who aren't fully divine, but aren't merely human either. beings whose job is to transmit order, knowledge, and sacred structure into the world. In later Akkadian tradition, the most famous of these are the Apkallu, often translated as sages. In Sumerian context, the concept appears in related forms: wise ones, culture bringers, divine advisors connected to the earliest eras. And what's important is not whether every detail matches perfectly across centuries. What matters is the category. Mesopotamia preserves, alongside its king list, a consistent idea that the earliest period involved special beings whose function was mediation, not ruling through force, not governing through law, but stabilizing, teaching, installing. That's exactly the kind of function we've been seeing hinted at in the king list antediluvian section. Now, let's be careful here. I'm not saying the king list is secretly describing fishmen walking around giving lectures. But I am saying that Mesopotamian thought preserves a category for transitional authority beings, and that category lines up disturbingly well with what the king list implies about pre-flood kingship. Because in many later sources, the Apkallu are connected to the time before the flood, and they're often described as bringing civilization itself, writing, ritual knowledge, temple order, the arts of divination, the proper ways to maintain divine-human relationships. And then, after the flood, the category changes. The Apkallu withdraw, or they become corrupted, or they are replaced by more human equivalents, priests, scholars, ritual specialists, which mirrors the king list's basic structure. Pre-flood, cosmic mediation. Flood, boundary reset. Post-flood, human administration. So the question becomes, could the antediluvian kings be remembered in the same conceptual space as these sages? Not identical, but adjacent, because in Mesopotamian logic, kingship and wisdom are not separate. Authority is tied to sacred knowledge. The king isn't just the strongest man. He's the one who holds the right relationship to the gods. He is the one who knows the ordinances, maintains the temple, performs the rituals, ensures the world stays aligned. And that's why pre-flood rulers like Enmen-Duran have become associated with divine instruction. In later tradition, Enmeduranki isn't remembered for conquering cities. He's remembered for receiving secret knowledge directly from the gods. He is taught how to read signs. He is given tablets. He becomes the origin point for priestly and divinatory lines. That is exactly how a bridge figure is remembered, not as a politician, as a transmitter. Now here's another detail that makes this category even more interesting. These intermediary beings are often depicted as having mixed nature. In later Mesopotamian art, Apkallu are sometimes represented as part human, part other. Fish cloaks, bird heads, wings, hybrid iconography that signals liminality, being between realms, between categories, and whether those depictions are literal or symbolic. The symbolism is clear. They're not ordinary humans. There's something closer to the border, something designed for crossing, something capable of living where normal humans can't. Now go back to the king list. What does it imply about the antediluvian kings? That they operate in mythic time, that they embody kingship rather than merely hold office, that their reigns are measured in cosmic units, that they preside over a world described as unfinished, still stabilizing, still permeable between divine and terrestrial layers. That's exactly the kind of environment where in-between beings would be necessary. Because if reality itself is in transition, then the rulers of that reality would need to be transitional too. A human living fully within historical time, fully within mortal limitation, might not be suited to maintain cosmic structure, but an intermediary being might. So what does intermediary mean here practically? It means a capacity to exist in two frameworks at once, to stand in the human world while being aligned to divine ordinance, to maintain rituals not as mere performance, but as actual activation of cosmic patterns, to hold the boundaries steady, to transmit to me the decrees of reality into the built environment, cities, temples, social structure. And if you think about that, the antediluvian reign lengths start to look less like people living forever and more like offices operating in sacred time. Now, there's another category in Mesopotamian tradition that matters here, and it's older than most people realize. The idea that early humanity itself is not fully human, the way later humanity is. In many creation accounts, humans are made for a purpose, often to serve in temples, to maintain the god work, to perform labor that sustains divine order. In that framework, early humans are almost like an extension of cosmic maintenance. Their job is service. And the kings, especially in the earliest period, are like the apex of that service. The primary mediators, the ones who keep the system aligned. But after the flood, human society becomes more autonomous, more political, more chaotic. And rulers become more like managers of competing interests rather than cosmic anchors. So if the flood marks the moment the boundary seals, it also marks the moment humans become fully trapped inside historical time. Mortality isn't just biological. It becomes political. It becomes structural. Kings die, and their death destabilizes the entire system. That's what the King List begins tracking obsessively after the flood. Succession, defeat, transfer, collapse. Those things become central because authority is no longer held steady by cosmic alignment. And the intermediary category fades because the world no longer supports it. Now, here's the part that's going to make this feel even more real. Even in later Mesopotamian religion, when kingship is fully historical, rulers still attempt to position themselves as liminal. They adopt divine titles. They claim special knowledge. They emphasize their role as mediators. Some even flirt with divinity itself, like Naram Sin. Why? Because the cultural memory still tells them that kingship is supposed to be more than politics. That true legitimacy comes from being between realms, receiving authority from above and anchoring it on earth. So the antediluvian kings are not isolated weirdness. They are the origin model. They are the template later rulers keep trying to approximate, even when they can't. Even when the cosmos no longer allows it. Now, I want you to notice something subtle about the way the King List treats the antediluvian rulers compared to post-flood rulers. Post-flood kings feel personal. They have fathers and sons. They have dynastic lines. They have identifiable human drama. The antediluvian kings feel archetypal. Their names sound like roles. Their reigns sound like epics. Their function is described purely through location and duration, almost like they're not individuals in the way later kings are individuals, almost like they are offices embodied by a type of being. That's exactly how a culture remembers intermediaries, not as personal stories, but as foundational presences, as the ones who established conditions for civilization to exist at all. So if we ask, what were they? The best answer in Mesopotamian terms is not aliens or gods, but something like transitional authorities, sages, king figures, liminal mediators, beings suited to mythic time. And once the flood seals a boundary, those beings vanish, not because they were killed like ordinary people, but because the world they belonged ends. Their category becomes obsolete, and in its place, humans inherit kingship as a diminished institution, still sacred by ideology, still claimed as divine by mandate, but now operating entirely within human limitation. Which brings us to the final stretch of this journey. So if we pull back far enough, the King List stops being a bizarre ancient document and starts looking like a full arc, almost like a diagnosis of the human condition. It begins with a world where authority doesn't originate in people. It descends. It's installed. It's positioned in specific cities with specific cosmic functions. And it's administered by rulers who don't behave like human rulers, because their reigns exist in mythic time, not historical time. Then the flood comes, and with 5 blunt words, the King List marks a total transition. After the flood, kingship returns, but it returns diminished. And from that point on, the document reads like the story we recognize as history. Competition, war, dynasties rising and collapsing, power shifting through conquest, law codes emerging, bureaucracy expanding, monuments built like desperate attempts to create permanence against mortality. So now we have to ask what that arc is actually saying, because modern narratives tell us civilization is a climb. Early humans are scattered, then they settle, then they build cities, then they develop institutions, then they centralize power, simple to complex, primitive to advanced. That's the default story. But the King List implies a completely different shape. It implies that what we call history begins after something is lost, not after something is built, and it implies that human civilization, the kind of civilization we recognize with politics and warfare and law and bureaucracy, may be a response to that loss, a form of compensation, a way of managing power in a world where power is no longer automatically anchored in cosmic structure. So let's restate that, because it's easy to miss how radical it is. In the King List worldview, humanity doesn't rise into kingship. Humanity inherits kingship after a fall. And then history is the struggle to maintain and justify that inheritance inside human limitations. That's why later kings cling to divine language so desperately. That's why they obsess over temple building. That's why they carve their names into stone. That's why they produce law codes. They're trying to sustain authority without the original conditions that made authority stable. They're trying to rebuild a sense that legitimacy is real, objective, cosmological, not just a victory of whoever has the strongest army this decade. And that struggle never ends. Because if kingship becomes purely human, it becomes inherently unstable. Humans die. Humans compete. Humans lie. Humans betray. And without cosmic stabilization, political order becomes something you have to constantly recreate. Now think about the irony of written law in that light. We tend to celebrate the first law codes as the beginning of justice and civilization. But in this arc, law codes are also evidence that kingship has become insufficient, that authority no longer automatically aligns the world. So humans write rules to replace what used to be embedded. Written law is civilization's attempt to imitate cosmic order, and bureaucracy is civilization's attempt to maintain that imitation at scale. Clay tablets filled with grain receipts and labor assignments aren't just administration. They are the infrastructure of a world where sacred alignment isn't enough anymore. A world where power must be managed like a machine. So what's lost isn't just long reigns. What's lost is the possibility that authority could be self-evident. That legitimacy could be cosmological rather than political. That the structural reality itself could guarantee order. After the flood, reality doesn't guarantee it anymore. Humans have to. And that's why history looks like a cycle of collapse and reconstruction. Because no system humans build is permanent. Every dynasty ends. Every empire falls. Every law code gets rewritten. Every monument eventually crumbles. That's not pessimism. It's mortality working its way into political structure. And the King List feels like it knows that. It documents human time as a descent into shorter reigns, into instability, into constant contest. So progress, from the King List perspective, is complicated. Yes, humans become more capable. Yes, societies become more complex. But complexity is not the same thing as wholeness. Complexity can be a symptom of being disconnected from a simpler, stronger underlying structure, like building elaborate scaffolding because the foundation is gone. Now, here's where this becomes uncomfortably relevant, because the question the King List raises isn't just ancient, it's timeless. It's the same question that haunts every political system. Why should anyone rule? And why should anyone obey? Modern political philosophy tries to answer that in different ways: consent, law, rights, democracy, tradition, force. But the fact that we need so many theories tells you something. Legitimacy is not self-evident to us. It must be argued for. It must be constructed. It must be maintained. And the King List suggests that the reason it's so difficult is because we live after the boundary event. We live in historical time. We live in a world where kingship, or authority in general, is no longer installed as cosmic structure. We're improvising, and we've been improvising for thousands of years. Now, I want to connect this to something else in the King List that feels small, but actually carries weight. The list doesn't romanticize the break. It doesn't hide it. It doesn't pretend post-flood kings are equal to pre-flood kings. It records the difference plainly through numbers, through the collapse of scale, through the entry of violence, through the appearance of defeat and transfer. It preserves the memory of what was lost, even while using that memory to legitimize what comes after. That's a strange balance. It's like the culture needs the antediluvian past to justify present kingship, but it also knows the present kingship isn't what it used to be. So the king list becomes both a tool of legitimacy and a quiet confession of decline. It says, in effect, yes, kingship is sacred. Yes, it descends from heaven. Yes, your king is legitimate. But also, no, it is not the same kingship. No, the world is not the same. No, we do not live in the age of cosmic maintenance anymore. And that tension between sacred claim and historical reality sits at the heart of Mesopotamian kingship. It's why kings must constantly perform piety, why they must constantly rebuild temples, why they must constantly declare divine favor, because the world doesn't naturally show it anymore. It has to be displayed. And when you reach later periods, Akkadian, UR3, Old Babylonian, you can almost feel kings trying to stabilize the world through sheer effort, through administration, through law, through force, through monuments, through ritual. It's civilization as constant maintenance, which, again, mirrors the antediluvian model, but now the maintenance is human, and that's the core of the fall. The maintenance didn't disappear. It changed hands, from cosmic intermediaries operating in mythic time to humans struggling in historical time. So now we're ready for the final part, because once you see the entire arc, the opening line of the King List lands with a totally different weight. When kingship was lowered from heaven, that isn't just a mythic flourish. It's a worldview. It's a statement about what authority is and where it comes from. So we've made it all the way back to the first line, the one that started this whole descent. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was an Eridu. After everything we've walked through, that sentence doesn't sound like a simple myth anymore. It sounds like a claim about reality, a claim about authority, a claim about what humans are and what we inherited. Because the Sumerian King List isn't just telling you who ruled, it's telling you what rule is. It begins by saying kingship is not something humans invented. It is not the natural product of social evolution. It is not a gradual outcome of villages getting bigger and people needing coordination. It is something that exists first in the divine realm and then gets transferred, lowered into the human world. And it doesn't arrive as a vague blessing. It arrives as an institution, a complete apparatus, a thing with weight, a thing that can be in a city like a sacred presence. And the first city it inhabits is Eridu, the cosmic hinge point, the place where Enki's Abzu touches the surface world, where the decrees of reality, the me, are closest to human reach. That framing alone forces a reversal of the story we're used to telling about civilization. Modern thinking often imagines civilization as human achievement. We struggle, we invent, we develop, we create institutions, we centralize authority. But in the King List worldview, structure comes first. Order comes first. Cities come first. Kingship comes first. And then humans inhabit what has already been laid down, which means the origin of civilization isn't presented as a human rise. It's presented as the installation of cosmic architecture. And the rulers of that first era aren't presented like politicians. They're presented like anchors. Their reigns aren't measured in human lifespans. They're measured in cosmic phases. Tens of thousands of years, multiples of sacred units, durations tied to a worldview where time itself functions differently before the flood. So whether you interpret those reign lengths as mythic time, symbolic math, dynastic compression, astronomical encoding, or some mixture of all three, the foundational point still stands. The earliest kings are not framed as ordinary humans. They're framed as something else. Something suited to an unfinished world, a transitional reality, a time when heaven and earth had been separated but not fully sealed, when the boundary was still permeable, still requiring maintenance, still close enough that authority could move directly from divine decree into terrestrial structure. And then the flood comes, not as a moral fable, not as a story about human wickedness alone, but as a boundary event, a reset, a forced reconfiguration of reality. The King List marks with a 5-word brutality. Then the flood swept over. And that brutality is honest, because what language is adequate for an event that ends an entire cosmic configuration? After the flood, kingship descends again, but it descends into Kish, into a new political landscape where the old sacred network is gone, and kingship returns diminished. Reign lengths collapse. Mortality enters politics. Violence enters transfer. The king list begins tracking defeat, overthrow, conquest. Kingship becoming a prize rather than a station. And from that moment, history begins. Not history, as in people start writing things down. History as in the human condition we recognize. Power contested. Legitimacy argued. Authority defended. Order maintained through human effort rather than cosmic alignment. And that arc changes how we should read everything that comes after. Because if you follow the king list logic, then what we call progress, the rise of law codes, bureaucracy, monumental architecture, empires, is also a symptom. It's humanity building elaborate systems to manage an inheritance that no longer fits perfectly. We inherit kingship without the original stabilizing framework. So we compensate. We write laws because authority no longer embodies justice automatically. We build administration because order no longer holds itself through sacred structure. We build walls because power can be seized. We carve names into stone because kings die and memory fades. We perform rituals as reenactments of a direct connection that once existed more fully. And later kings know this, even if they can't say it openly. That's why they cling to divine language. That's why they insist the gods chose them. That's why some of them, like Naram Sin, try to become divine themselves. Because deep in the cultural memory preserved by the king list, kingship is supposed to be more than politics. It is supposed to be cosmic. So what does the king list ultimately preserve? Not a story about aliens. Not a story about lost technology. Not even necessarily a story about little immortal beings walking the earth for 40,000 years. What it preserves is something subtler, and in some ways more unsettling. A memory of a world where authority was not negotiated, where legitimacy was not debated, where kingship was installed as part reality structure, where power functioned as maintenance, not competition, where cities were nodes of sacred geography rather than human experiments, where rulers were mediators suited to mythic time, bridging divine ordinance and terrestrial existence. And then it preserves a memory of losing that world. The king list doesn't try to hide the break. It records it. It continues forward, documenting the long aftermath. Kingship becoming human, unstable, contested, violent, administrative. It becomes confession encoded as a chronicle. History begins in the moment the cosmic framework withdraws. And everything we recognize as civilization is, in that view, humanity learning to govern itself with an institution that was never meant to originate with us. That's why the king list remains so haunting. Because it doesn't just challenge our understanding of ancient Mesopotamia. It challenges our assumptions about authority itself. It suggests that the oldest written political tradition doesn't treat governance as human invention at all. It treats it as something inherited, borrowed, diminished, something that descends from a larger order we can no longer access directly. And if that's true, if even as myth it reflects a deep instinct about the fragility of legitimacy, then it raises one last question that doesn't belong to the ancient world alone. It belongs to us. If kingship was never originally ours, if authority was never meant to be generated purely from human struggle, if the first rulers were suited to a world where reality itself required direct maintenance, then what does that mean about how we've been trying to solve legitimacy ever since? Are we progressing towards something better? Or are we still improvising with fragments, building systems on top of systems, trying to recreate through law and bureaucracy what once existed as cosmic structure? The king list doesn't give us an answer. It doesn't tell us what to do. It simply preserves the memory. It starts with kings who may not have been fully human. It draws a hard boundary called the flood. And it hands the rest of the story to us. Humans in historical time, governing as best we can, try and hold order together with mortal hands. So the next time you hear someone talk about civilization like it's a straight upward climb, primitive to advanced, remember what the oldest king list in human history actually begins with. Not a human king, but kingship lowered from heaven. And if that's the origin story the first writers of history chose to record, what else about our beginnings have we misunderstood? Shoot,